Police are squabbling with protesters. Oh, there we go.
Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot!
And now they're.
Gosh.
And now they're.
Gosh.
Flashbangs in front of them and mounted police to clear what has been an entirely peaceful protest. Not 98%, not 99%, but 100% peaceful protest here today.
It's the faithless logician, dropping what's been missing. Coming for the jugular, but not let me catch you slipping. No tool needed other than my mind to dissect these delusions and correct them in real time. The slayer of dogma and baseless assertions don't come with that weak shit or you'll soon need a surgeon. But it's too late for your argument. It's been torn and shred. There is no coming back. It is completely dead. All I need is my brain and my pen to use as I see fit to flay and or mend these inexcusable policies that are impossible to defend. All I need is my brain and my pen. No trust needed, just take a second and listen as I redirect and clear your clouded attention to focus on the facts, evidence, and testable predictions, painting a picture to help explain these insights, hypotheses, and suspect claims, giving you the tools needed to separate the truth from the false and the utterly inane. The marks are legion and too many to name, but they all love money, bathing in it with no shame, while the rest of us later their scraps struggling just to maintain. They've never read a war that they would not fund, yet they treat citizens asking for healthcare as low-life scum. But we're done asking, so get ready, because here the we come.
On January 6th, tens of thousands of rabid Trump supporters flocked to Washington, D.C. for the Stop the Steal rally, and a significant portion of them stormed the Capitol building, resulting in the deaths of 4 Trump supporters, including Air Force veteran Ashley Babbitt, who was shot dead by the Capitol Police for trying to breach a barrier. The only other fatality was a CPD officer named Brian Sicknick, who succumbed to his injuries after reportedly being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher. More details about the death have not yet been released, but an investigation is underway. Though that's hardly the only thing that needs investigated. Why in 7 hells was the 2,000-strong Capitol Police Force, the same force that was decked out in full combat gear for Black Lives Matter protests, so utterly inept in their preparations and response to the Trumpsters? And the Black Lives Matter protests were hardly an exception. For whether it's disability activists fighting for their rights, or any other group of people peacefully gathering at the Capitol to protest, police have no qualms with arresting and or harassing them. From queer rights activists fighting for their equality and right to exist, to climate crusaders and water protectors who are fighting for everyone's ability to exist. And of course, proponents of peace. One May Day in particular during the Vietnam War and under the Nixon administration saw tens of thousands of angry anti-war protesters descend on Washington, D.C. Though that day, the 5,000-strong police presence backed by 1,400 National Guardsmen were ready to greet them and wasted little time arresting and detaining over 12,000 predominantly peaceful protesters. While in contrast, only 82 Trump supporters have been arrested, and most of those took place after the fact or outside before they stormed the Capitol and had nothing to do with occupying the building. I'm not saying that the cops should have harassed, beaten, and arrested them the way they do BLM and water protectors. In fact, I'd like to see cops act more civil with all protesters. But you can do that while still holding your ground and not willingly letting the protesters breach the barrier and then fraternizing and taking selfies with them after they're in the building. Some might say they didn't have enough of a presence to hold off the protesters and had no other choice but to let them through. Except the chief of the Capitol Police, who has since stepped down, Stephen Sons, says he did ask for backup from the National Guard, but his request was downplayed or outright ignored no less than 6 times. As for why, well, House Surgeon of Arms Paul Irving told Chief Sons it came down to optics. That reason was reiterated by the Director of Army Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Piott, who told Chief Sons and other officers on a conference call, quote, "I don't like the visual of the National Guard standing a police line with the Capitol in the background." A similar sentiment came from D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, who reportedly wanted a light police presence to avoid a similar scenario to last summer, when the National Guard was called in and used tear gas and rubber bullets to clear a path for the president to take a photo op at Lafayette Park across the street from the White House. But again, no one was asking them to tear gas and beat protesters, but just for them to be there and maintain civility. The National Guard was eventually deployed, though hours after the breach. But Chief Sons maintains that had the National Guard been there from the beginning as requested, it would have been enough to ensure the safety of the building and the people inside. But regardless of what caused the Capitol chaos, this clearly was not a coup. I wouldn't even call it an insurrection. It was mainly a bunch of woefully misinformed idiots aimlessly wandering around the Capitol for a few hours. Yes, there were some scary individuals there armed to the teeth, and at least one deranged person brought zip ties, and they should be prosecuted to the fullest. But they were the exception, not the norm.
Hey! Fucking hey, man. Glad to see you guys. You guys are fucking patriots. Look at this guy. He's got covered in blood. God bless you.
Yes.
You good, sir? Do you need medical attention?
I'm good, thank you.
All right.
I got shot in the face. Where are they? I got shot in the face with some kind of plastic bullet.
Any chance I could get you guys to leave the Senate wing?
We will. I've been making sure they ain't disrespecting the place.
Okay, just want to let you guys know this is like the sacredest place.
I know. Right?
And it's not like the US or its media are any strangers to what an actual coup looks like. The CIA and other US forces have either outright committed or in some way aided in countless coups over the decades, usually by backing right-wing extremist groups. As was the case with the recent multiple failed attempts at assassinating and or deposing the democratically elected government of Venezuela, to the successful coups of Brazil, Chile, the Congo, Syria, and many, many more. And of course, our state media is always right there to manufacture consent and cheer them on, just as they were there to encourage Trump to bomb Syria on evidence-free claims that have since been proven false. Or like when Judith Miller of the New York Times, who was all too happy to help the Bush administration lie us into an illegal war responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in Iraq. Because our media is always ready to enable the wars of the ruling class and are certainly no strangers to inciting violence. With the most blatant recent example being the emphatic backing of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Because apparently, Russians are way more dangerous than actual fascists. Or at least Biden and the Obama administration thought so when they enlisted them to lead an actual insurrection against their democratically elected government. And these are the very same neo-Nazi groups that Trump was impeached for not aiding a little over a year ago. The aid in question being $400 million in Tomahawk missiles and other military munitions. Speaking of impeachment, 10 months into a global pandemic and economic crisis that our government has worked to respectively worsen and cause, our political leaders could not find the time to take care of its people. Though that same government had no issue with writing up another round of meaningless articles of impeachment for a president that will be out of office by the time you're hearing this. But at least it distracts from our political leaders' utter ineptitude and inadequate response to the needs of the people. But if you're worried because you can't feed your kids, pay for medicine, or even house you and your family, there's no need to fear, because getting the people monthly checks, Medicare for all, and in their homes is of the utmost importance to the Democrats. And they will get right on it as soon as they can. It's just that now is not the right time. If Trump or anyone else actually did incite violence, again, they should be held accountable. I just don't see this as being that. But you can make up your own mind. Here are the tweets in question, as well as the speech he gave the day of. Feel free to pause the video and assess them for yourself. But I have to agree with Glenn Greenwald and others when they say this does not meet the standard of incitement, nor the precedent set by case law.
This case called Claiborne versus the NAACP, in the 1960s and 1970s, the NAACP in like Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, were advocating boycotts against white-owned stores, against stores that they believe were engaging in injustice. And they would have their leaders, these affiliate NAACP organizations, give these really fiery speeches about the need to enforce the boycott. And members of the NAACP would hear these speeches, young, members who had just joined a couple of years ago were super passionate, and they would go out and they would like burn stores down, or they would like physically attack patrons who were violating the boycott. And the state of Mississippi sued the NAACP leaders, saying you're responsible for having riled these people up and incited this violence. And the state court of Mississippi ruled in favor of the state and imposed a bunch of liability on the NAACP, and it got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said unanimously that if you're engaged in protected political speech, saying that you think an election is fraudulent, saying that you think the boycott is justifiable, you cannot be held responsible for violent acts, even if your protected speech inspires those acts, if you're not intending to incite imminent violence. You're even allowed to advocate the justifiability of violence in the abstract. The one thing you're not allowed to do, said both cases, is incitement, and it was very narrowly defined, meaning like essentially you're outside somebody's house with a mob assembled, and you say to them, it's time to go burn down that person's house, where you're literally inciting imminent violence, like essentially immediately. So you would have to have Trump speaking to a crowd or going on Twitter and saying not just this election is fraudulent, and not just saying it's time to go protest at the Capitol, because lots of Democrats say that about the 2016 election, the 2004 election, the 2000 election, those were stolen, they're fraudulent, it's time to protest. You need Trump to say, go attack the people in the Capitol,
it's time
kidnap
to storm
them.
the Capitol.
Yeah. And he didn't do that, not at that rally nor on Twitter.
To be clear, there's absolutely no denying that racism and bigotry are a huge problem in the United States, nor the fact that policing and white supremacy have been joined at the hip since the former's inception. In fact, the FBI has been aware of the threat of white nationalism for decades. One internal FBI study conducted shortly after Barack Obama became president found that right-wing extremists were capitalizing on the election of the first black president, sending recruitment numbers skyrocketing, and concluded that, quote, lone wolves in small terrorist cells embracing violent right-wing extremist ideology are the most dangerous domestic terrorist threats in the United States. Yet instead of actually doing anything about this, the unit tasked with monitoring the extremist was largely dismantled and the findings were ultimately ignored. Presumably because it was not politically expedient to their goals at the time, and instead chose to focus on the boogeyman du jour, Muslims. Though I guess things have changed. I actually covered this topic earlier this summer if you would like to learn more. So yes, white nationalists most definitely need dealt with, especially those that led the Capitol siege. But I believe the bigger problem has less to do with individual racists and has way more to do with the systemic racism that pervades nearly all aspects of our society, that incentivizes and exploits the racist tendencies of certain individuals to ensure we stay divided and fighting amongst ourselves, and most importantly, to maintain the status quo. Which is why it's no surprise that the media is encouraging everyone to spy on and rat out their neighbors and coworkers, to look at them sideways and perceive them as the ones to blame for all of our problems. Except other poor people are rarely the root cause for your circumstances. Chances are they're a result of much bigger underlying systemic problems that we as a society refuse to deal with. And the establishment knows those structural changes cannot take place until we finally come together and demand it. So don't believe the hype. The FBI has state-of-the-art facial recognition software and can even grab your fingerprints from just a photo of your hand. They don't need your help. This is just to get you comfortable with surveilling and selling out your fellow Americans, to shift the blame and focus away from ever actually dealing with the rotted and corrupted system we are all trapped in and at the mercy of. Does anyone honestly believe that tens of thousands of Americans would have stormed and occupied the Capitol had our government done the bare minimum of taking care of its people during a time of crisis? If we had had substantial reoccurring monthly checks since the beginning and finally joined the rest of the developed world in giving its people health care that's free at the point of service? I certainly do not think so. But you won't hear this sentiment discussed on cable news. If anything, it's the media that's stoking the flames of violence. It's the mainstream press that has each of us locked into our chosen echo chamber and feeding us our preferred fantasies, instead of just telling us the cold, hard truth. Basically, the red fantasy is that Trump is the answer to all of our problems, while the blue version says everything will magically be better once he is gone, and both are detached from reality. So no, this was not another Pearl Harbor and has nothing to do with dealing with racism, nor is it about holding the lawless accountable. It's about keeping us frustrated and fractured enough to push through a fresh round of censorship and surveillance. You see, the ruling class doesn't have to commit the chaos, they just need to wait for it to occur. Then, using the shock and uncertainty of the situation, they're able to pass the proposals they've wanted all along. In that sense, the Capitol siege does have one striking resemblance to the terror attack on 9/11. If all goes well, both will have been used to start unnecessary so-called wars on terror. In this way, instead of receiving the rightful pushback and backlash these draconian proposals deserve, the people are right there to cheer them on as saviors of our imagined democracy. Back then, no more than 72 hours after the towers had fallen, the infamous authorization to use military force that has since been used to justify the war on terror, including the 2-decade-long bloody boondoggle known as the War in Afghanistan, along with our military engagements in Syria, Iraq, Libya, the Sudan, Somalia, and many more countries that had absolutely nothing to do with the terror attack. They also used the chaos and subsequent fear to pass the notorious Patriot Act, the unconstitutional mass surveillance system that collects any and all electronic transmissions that take place within the United States. The invasion of the Capitol and its 24-hour coverage are currently creating a similar call to do, well, something. And while it certainly wasn't on the level of a Pearl Harbor or 9/11, it was an attack on the Capitol, and there should be consequences. Though I'm confident there are sufficient laws on the books already capable of dealing with this, without needing to come up with any new ones. Because if recent history is any indicator, any new laws, agencies, or other outcomes will be drastically more detrimental to our society than the actual attack itself. It's not completely clear what exactly they have in store for us this time, but we should all be on the lookout for any language that suggests modifying the First Amendment's free speech laws, the cornerstone of any free society. This is the rhetoric of actual fascists, such as Andrew McCarthy, who used the Red Scare to criminalize and de facto cancel his political opponents, which is what fascists always do when they know they cannot legitimately win the battle of ideas. This isn't some radical take, or at least it shouldn't be. As I mentioned earlier, this is settled case law that has been the cornerstone of our perceived democracy since its inception. But that's what manufacturing consent is all about. Persuading the public to suddenly change their long-held position on a particular political issue, usually by associating it with someone or something that most can easily despise. Like in 2018 when they used Alex Jones to justify and distract from hundreds if not thousands of leftist outlets and dissenting voices being purged from social media. Voices that had absolutely nothing to do with the right-wing commentator nor his political views, including several police accountability watchdog groups such as Cop Block, Police the Police, and the Free Thought Project. In this case, it's the Orange Menace himself. Here are the tweets that got Trump banned, along with Twitter's suspect reasoning. Again, if you would like, please pause the video and review the material for yourself. But I do not see how these are any different from his normal boisterous bloviating. And even Biden fully agreed with the second tweet in question, saying it was a good thing for him not to attend the inauguration. But this isn't about Trump and whether or not he actually incited violence. This is about pinning all of our problems on a single sacrifice that most can agree on slaughtering, and pretending that'll magically fix everything. Except Trump is more like the scapegoat that is released into the wild bearing all of our worries and wrongdoings, while our First Amendment rights are ultimately offered up to pay the bloody price of perceived safety and security. This is a reactionary way of dealing with things and will surely come back to bite the left in the ass. Because, as any student of history can tell you, It always does. In fact, it's already happening. Independent outlets such as Status Quo, who do vital and sorely needed on-the-ground reporting, are having their live streams and other work censored and or shut down for arbitrary, whimsical reasons with no warning nor workable recourse available for the time-sensitive material. Because they can't have actual journalists exposing the truth and unraveling their carefully concocted version of events. So, indie journalists have quickly become public enemy number one in this fight to control the narrative. And they're only getting more brazen, as veteran and venerated reporter Susie Dawson, who was locked out of her Twitter account for seemingly no reason, and left-wing podcasts such as Red Scare Pod, who've been kicked off of various platforms with little to no explanation, can attest. Facebook even locked out former Congressman Ron Paul from his own page, again, without giving any explanation. So, even though this crackdown, or whatever you would like to call it, was supposed to focus on white nationalists and other hate groups, predictably, countless libertarian and socialist-aligned individuals and organizations, such as the Socialist Equality Party, are being mysteriously caught up in the fray. And for a little cherry on top, in a recent Senate hearing with the heads of 3 of the biggest tech monopolies in the world, the CEO of Google's parent company, Alphabet, admits that they regularly censor certain liberal ideologies and outlets such as the World Socialist website. The executive went on to state that Google has, quote, moderation policies that they apply equally. And apparently, the WSWS has been censored for failing to comply with these policies. Whatever the fuck any of that means. And I know a lot of people will say that these are private companies that have the right to terminate and or censor any account that they wish. But I disagree with this notion on at least 2 levels. First and foremost, Facebook and other tech industry giants work hand in glove with the government, who pay them billions to do their bidding. And much like the military-industrial complex, big pharma, big oil, and big business in general, there's a revolving door connecting Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. Facebook specifically notoriously teamed up with the infamous Atlantic Council in May of 2018. Which coincidentally was only a few months before Alex Jones was used as an excuse to purge and deplatform lefty outlets. This relationship is particularly concerning considering the Atlantic Council's ties to the likes of the Saudi royal family, the Koch brothers, big oil, and you guessed it, the military-industrial complex. The stated reasoning behind this partnership was to ensure election integrity and to monitor misinformation. Which is hilarious considering that instead of diffusing the flurry of baseless Russiagate conspiracies bombarding the airways over the past few years, they used it to justify their existence. So basically, the corporate class that ultimately controls this country have tasked the Atlantic Council with curating our social media and other news feeds to ensure we only ever see pre-approved narratives. Because we can't have the poors getting any wild ideas now, can we? So whenever you hear the propagandists talk about stifling propaganda, you will know that is code for stomping out any and all dissenting voices. My second reason for why it's a horrible idea to let these $100 billion companies who are really just an extension of the security state have free reign over our airwaves is because Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter are the new public square. The largest, most easily accessible public square in the history of our species. And if these tech giants are able to get away with canceling the supposed most powerful man on the planet on suspect grounds with no input from the courts nor the public, what in the world is there to stop them from censoring you? These companies should be considered as utilities, meaning like a phone company, they should not be held accountable for what is said or have any say in what is and what isn't acceptable. There's already laws on the books against hate speech and inciting violence. If either of those or another crime is taking place via social media, then that is a matter for the authorities. Ultimately, this is about 3 things that are all aimed at the same goal. 1. Manufacturing consent for new domestic terrorism laws and convincing Americans to gleefully gift away their First Amendment rights. 2. Sending a warning to any would-be populists thinking of using their pull and influence with the public to engage in direct action. And 3. Making it that much harder to organize and or protest in general. With the ultimate goal being to maintain our deeply rooted societal divisions to ensure we stay as ignorant as possible in fighting amongst ourselves, instead of rightfully turning on the ruling class. Because they know in order to maintain the status quo, they must keep the people poor, sick, and in a perpetual state of fear and anxiety. Though, make no mistake, the establishment is scared. With BLM and other lefty groups protesting in the summer and now right-wingers going crazy in the winter, they knew it was only a matter of time before we realized our grievances are not so dissimilar. Inequality, lack of health care, and the fact that wages in this country have been stagnant for 40 plus years affects everyone outside of the top tax bracket. And I'm not saying class is the only problem we face, just that it's the prevailing one that actively drives all the others. From climate change, which is a direct result of our suicidal pursuit of endless profits on a planet with finite resources, to the endless wars that drive our economy of death. From the lack of healthcare and stagnant wages that keep us too sick and tired to do anything about it, to the censorship that ensures we stay ignorant of it all. Which is why they desperately needed this very convenient capital chaos to distract us from who the enemy really is. To shut down the calls for Medicare for all and monthly stimulus checks. And most importantly, to prevent working class Americans from across racial and ethnic lines from coming together to form a rainbow coalition with the common goal of wresting control of our country away from the corporate class and their political cronies and finally putting it into the hands of the people. It's past time we put down our petty differences and start working together to focus our time, energy, and righteous anger in a more productive direction and against the common enemy. Thanks for watching. I know this one was a bit long and it took a while to get out, but I feel that it was necessary. Stay safe out there, and for fuck's sake, wear your damn mask. And get in the streets. Jana.
I do not think that the state ought to have the right to determine historical truth and to punish people who deviate from it. I'm not willing to give the state that right, even if they happen to
But are you denying that the gas chambers ever existed?
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech. Now, you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive the people who express utterly offensive views, I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, you're defending that person's views. No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
Is there anything like objectivity, or scientific objectivity, reality? As a scientist,
look, I'm not saying I defend the views. Look, if somebody publishes a scientific article, which I disagree with, I do not say the state ought to put him in jail, right?
All right, but you don't have to support him right away and say, you know, I support him just for the sake of everybody saying that, you know, whatever he wants to say.
Suppose this guy is taken to court and charged with falsification. Then I'm going to defend him, even if I disagree.
But he wasn't taken to court.
Oh, you're wrong.
But when did you write the support? I mean,
when he was brought to court. And in fact, the only support that I gave him is to say he has a right of freedom of speech, period.